Let's talk about discussion questions. Today I want to talk about the kinds of discussion questions that you ask when your book club gets together to talk about a book. Lots of books today are being published with discussion guides in the back of them, but I find that some of those guides actually stifle good conversation. So I want to talk about 3 kinds of questions that don't really help move a conversation forward, and then I'll give you some examples of the kinds of discussion questions that I think do move the conversation forward when your book club gets together. There are a few different kinds of questions that I find really don't work so well for book club discussions. I've visited a lot of book clubs and I've paid attention to the kinds of questions they're asking and what works and what doesn't. So here are a few suggestions. Avoid the discussion guide questions that sound like they're worded like English paper assignments. So for example, questions that ask you to compare and contrast 2 things in the book, or to discuss an example of such and such, or discuss the irony of such and such in the novel. Those are the kinds of questions that turn my students' hearts cold. They do the same thing to book clubs. Maybe the most problematic questions that are asked in reading guides are questions that lead to a pretty obvious answer. So questions that ask things about the plot that anybody who's read carefully understands, or about obvious symbols or obvious ironies in the story. Those kinds of questions are going to be shut down right away because somebody's going to answer them and nobody else will have anything to add. The third kind of question that I found really interesting when I visited book clubs was a question about how the characters were behaving. These are really common questions in reading guides, and they're asking questions about the characters as if the characters were real people. So when a question asks something like, "Do you think Anna Karenina should have gotten involved with Vronsky?" The answer is yes, of course she should have. If she hadn't, there would be no novel. Now, I'm not suggesting that you can't talk about the characters and their motivations, what makes them interesting, the choices they've made, but keep in mind that they're characters. When we talk about literature, we're talking about a construct, something that's been written by an author, and that's one of the things that a lot of reading groups never get around to talking about. Think about this the next time your reading group is talking about a book. What choices do you think the author had to make in order to make the novel work? What choices did the author make that caused the novel not to work? Another kind of discussion question that works is one that draws your attention to a particular passage in the novel, that asks a question about diction or word choice, that pays attention to the beauty of language, or that draws attention to a particular idea that's raised in a specific passage. So before you even come to your book club meeting, think about marking up some passages in the novel that really struck you for some reason, and bring those in for discussion. Another great kind of discussion group question draws your attention to sources outside the book you're reading that are related to it. So these could be things like book reviews, biographies of the author, or maybe sources that are actually mentioned in the text of the novel itself. Another great discussion question is to talk about how other books that you've read together as a group relate to the book that you're currently reading. Does anything remind you of an earlier book that you read together? Or were there any themes that seem to be crossing over or that seem to attract your group over and over again? Those are also really interesting questions to explore together. The next time you're working with a reading guide in the back of a book that you've read together, think about these guidelines. Think about which kinds of questions are going to elicit the best conversation from the group and which kinds of questions might fall flat. Read on!